Hello and welcome to episode 16 of What's Tom Reading. I'm Tom, and today I'm talking about the book Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. This book is about the philosophy surrounding success and how keeping your ego in check is one of the best things you can do to make sure that you get where you're going. This one was super useful for me, and I think it'll be super useful for you too, so stay tuned. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. All right, so as I said, today we are talking about the awesome book, Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. This book has a special place in my heart because I am actually a pretty big fan of the author, Ryan Holiday, kind of outside of this, context. I don't really know that much about him personally, but I do listen to his podcast called The Daily Stoic, and I've read his book that is titled the same, The Daily Stoic, and I love them both. I'm a huge fan of that. If you're interested in a bite-sized podcast that will help you to know and understand Stoic philosophy and the benefits that it can have on your life, then I highly recommend that you check out his podcast. Again, it's called The Daily Stoic. So just a few quick notes before we go any further on this episode. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an update on how things are going. So the last time we spoke, I was pretty sick and I wanted to squeeze in an episode before the end of the year. As of this recording, it is the 6th of January, 2022, the middle of the night, again, as usual. And I have yet to get another episode out. Honestly, I've been pretty wiped out with the whole ordeal of the holidays. I can honestly say that I have never been more sick in my life, and it has taken a little bit of time to get back up to strength. I think I am pretty much there now with most of the major effects of the illness more or less gone. But if I go outside, it's, January and it's cold outside. If I go outside, I get chilled down pretty quickly. And usually I don't have a problem with that. But I think it's just kind of a lingering effect of the illness. And if you can detect any of that in my voice, then I apologize. Hopefully, as I said, I'll be back to normal full strength before too much time. So, I have finished a couple of books since the start of the year. And as I said before, I set a goal for myself to read 100 books in 2022. And that means 100 podcast episodes. And obviously, I'm a little bit behind schedule with the podcast episodes. I just wanted to let you guys know, in case you care, that I'm not behind schedule on my book reading. So I'm trying to stay focused on getting that done. I'm back to classes again in the business school, and, everything that comes with the beginning of a new semester, new professors and classes, and kind of getting into the rhythm of homework and assignments and group projects and yada, 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 all that goes along with that. But I have been able to keep on my reading partially because I've spent a lot of time being sick, and that's a good time to read. So I just need to get caught up on recording the books that I finished. And this book, Ego is the Enemy, is the one that's most fresh in my mind. So I'm going to hustle to get good content out as quickly as I can, but I want to make sure that I keep the quality up. So I'm not just going to kind of shotgun books out there. So it might take a little bit of time for me to get caught all the way up, but I'm going to try to prioritize that so that I can stay on track with this kind of ambitious goal that we've set for this year. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. And before we jump into the book, I wanted to take some time to talk about the author. So interestingly, because of the context of the book, he introduces himself at the beginning of the book, and he was basically, long story short, he was somewhat of a wunderkind during the early part of his career. Excuse me, I'm going to touch the microphone for a second here. My pop filter dropped off. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too loud. But basically, Ryan Holiday, he's kind of a wunderkind during the early part of his career. He drops out of college and hitches his wagon to an up-and-coming company that has since imploded, but he had a wildly successful ride at the beginning. He wrote a book that became like an instant bestseller, and he had people reaching out, according to him, and I believe him, from all corners of the earth to try and be his mentor and to just to see where he was going. He was obviously a kid who was going places. And in short, he was just a very successful guy from a very young age. He has a lot of experience with ego inflation, and he ends up writing this book from a place of experience after he watched ego ruin many great men around him. And it actually put his own life in serious jeopardy. And along the way, he picks up Stoic philosophy through the writings of Epictetus, and I'm personally a lot more partial to Marcus Aurelius. Someday, maybe I will be Stoic enough in my soul to be able to stomach more of Epictetus. I have a book of his writings on my shelf right now, and I'll probably, hopefully, manage to squeeze it in to my 100 books this year if I end up getting enough momentum to get involved with some of the deeper literature that I have lying around. I'd like to read, for example, some Dostoevsky and the like sometime, but honestly, I'm almost ashamed to say this, but I find that stuff just mind-alteringly boring at the moment. And so I might have to wait a little longer until my palate evolves to that level. Hopefully it will. Hopefully eventually I'll be able to stomach that deep literature that supposedly is, well, and I believe the people who say it's like the best in the world, best in history. I just need to get myself to a place where I can stomach it. But anyways, that's the gist of the author. And I think the best use of our time throughout this episode, and as I said, we'll be returning to the standard format of the show with this episode. So, we'll do the science, history, random corners in the middle as usual, something to look forward to, right? But I think the best use of our time is for me to include just a healthy sprinkling of all of the useful bits of knowledge that I picked up from this book. And there were a few things that I didn't love about it, and I'll save those for the end, as is customary after the review and everything like that. It's going to be basically a normal podcast episode to kind of get back into the swing of things. So I think a good place to start discussing ego is to give an example of someone who we are all familiar with, at least on some level, and that is Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, founder, CEO of Apple, who make the computers and the iPhones and the iPads and all of the things, basically all of the technology. And apologies here if you can hear noise coming from my microphone. The pop filter is freaking out. I'm just trying to get it situated. So Steve Jobs had a notoriously huge ego, and you might be thinking that it's no wonder that he did, because after all, he was one of the most successful and innovative businessmen to ever have lived. He changed the world in more ways than most of us can possibly even dream of doing. And so basically, was his ego just part of the recipe for success? The answer is emphatically no. His ego actually got in the way a lot of times throughout his career. For example, it stopped him from building the iPhone for over a year. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But basically, his ego made him abuse the people around him until none of them wanted anything to do with him or Apple ever again. And I've spoken to some people who have worked at Apple, and some of my professors at the business school kind of talk about Apple having this reputation, or at least it used to back when Steve Jobs was there, of they were just basically a company under the leadership of Steve Jobs that they'll just like wring the best of your talents and like the light of your life in your working years. They'll just wring it out of you, and basically they'll leave you with your throat cut at the side of the road when they're finished with you. They'll use you up and spit you out. And basically it's because it was a borderline abusive environment. Basically, there's no way to put a finer point on it than that. Steve Jobs is kind of famous for having a huge temper, for just like yelling and screaming at people and cursing at people. And eventually his personality and his ego grow so out of control that the board of directors vote to have him thrown out of his own company. And so when that happens, he sells all but one share of his Apple stock, and he swears off ever having anything to do with the company again. But, naturally, genius never rests. And during his period of absence from Apple, he founded Pixar, which is another titanically successful and influential company. But as Holiday mentions in the book, it's kind of unique. Steve Jobs is kind of unique among people with like monstrous egos, because he actually started to work on himself during this kind of involuntary sabbatical from Apple. He basically was able to iron out a lot of the kinks in his own personality, and eventually Apple decides to bring him back on board, and he was a much improved person. Though admittedly, he did die with a massive ego, and he never really stopped mistreating the people around him. And the story of Steve Jobs here might make you think that ego comes with the territory of genius. But what you should actually be thinking is, how much more could this man have accomplished if not for his ego getting in the way? Right? Like, how many incredibly successful projects did he derail or outright destroy that might have added to his, already extremely impressive legacy? Right? Remember that he hated the idea of the iPhone for over a year. think of the courageous person or people who kept pushing for that product in spite of the like massive amount of abuse. And again, this abuse is often in the form of streams of screamed profanity that they're getting from their boss here. This person or group of people, whoever they were, who pushed and pushed on the iPhone, they changed the world in spite of Steve Jobs' ego. And eventually he said, okay, fine, you can go for it. And it's, you know, it's obviously Apple's mainstay product now, right? Like it's their bread and butter, and it changed the world. Literally, it's like changed the face of the planet. And so whoever those people are, they're the real heroes who brought the iPhone, yeah, like I said, one of the most revolutionary products in human history, into existence against the wishes of Steve Jobs' titanic ego. And that's important. And that's kind of the point that the author makes, is that, yeah, you do have these high-powered, high-performing individuals who reach the level of CEO. And a lot of times we just kind of think, well, you know, they're eccentric and their ego is just part of it. But the people who are like truly successful and are really, truly able to get things done in a big, big way, they actually do it more quietly than that, and without the ego and without the dramatics and without the flash and form and everything like that. There are some fantastic CEOs who, you know, for all kinds of different companies, and you know, they have just towed the line and run a respectful and respectable outfit and made good money for themselves and their shareholders and given good lives to their employees and innovated in many different ways, right? Like you don't have to be a butthole to be a genius and to be like good at being, you know, getting things done. And this book has a number of different stories about people who were both humble and egotistical, and it compares and contrasts them in some very interesting ways. And some of my favorite examples are of the great American generals throughout the years. And so, like, for example, so Ulysses S. Grant, he was the general of the Union forces during the end of the Civil War, after a string of just horrible generals like McClellan and Meade and like all these guys who, you know, had massive egos and like checked all the boxes, you know, for being, you know, politicians and West Point grads and yada, yada, yada. Grant was a West Point grad, but he was kind of at the bottom of his class, and he comes in and he's humble enough to get the job done. Basically, he's this unassuming guy. He understands that the Union has this huge numerical advantage over the Confederacy, and he just pushes that advantage and he leverages it. He leverages their strengths. He takes good fights. He avoids bad fights. He doesn't allow himself to be goaded into, you know, compromising positions as his predecessors had done. And he basically is able to squelch the genius of General Lee, who is the general of the Confederacy and, you know, one of the finer generals in history. He's basically able to squelch the genius of Lee under the overwhelming numerical and material advantages that his side has. And he does it without having the ego in place. So, right. Like he never wants to go mano a mano in a fair fight with Lee or whatever to show who's the better general or whatever. He just says, you know, yeah, we're going to win because I'm just going to grind you down. I'm not going to take bad fights. And he just kind of pushes and pushes. And he has, as one of his kind of under generals, is a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, who is famously just this humble guy. And he throughout his career avoids positions that he doesn't think he's ready for yet. And he only takes on a position when he's ready for it. And when he is ready for something, he says, okay, boss, I'm ready. Give me this job and I'll go do it. Famously, he like kind of split the entire Confederacy and burned his way all the way across the South to the sea and just eviscerated supply lines and, supply depots and cut off, lines of retreat and lines of communication. And just like this one massive push here under the direction of Grant, and, Sherman leads it. Basically, they end the war in this one fell swoop here. And Sherman is totally humble about it and totally, he accepts praise for it, but then he's doesn't overdo it. And then after the war, Grant gets kind of forced into politics and allows himself to be kind of led into politics, and he becomes the president. Sherman is they try to push him into politics as well. And he's like, nah, not really for me. I did my job and I'm done. And that's a big kind of theme for humble people, is that they set out to do a job and accomplish a thing, and they do it as best they can. And then they just kind of stay in their field of expertise. They don't allow themselves to be kind of goaded into doing things that they're not very good at. Grant allows himself to do that. He becomes a pretty inept president who has a pretty defunct administration, very corrupt. He leaves the presidency and goes and has a couple of highly publicized, shameful business dealings and becomes bankrupt and is ruined. And then basically spends the rest of his days, he's dying of throat cancer and he's trying to finish a memoir so that he can leave his wife and children with something to live off of when he's gone, and barely makes it, right? And that's kind of his legacy. And there's some correspondence between Sherman and Grant. And Sherman says, the problem with you, Grant, is that you went out and you tried to satisfy these men who would have given everything they have to have won one of your battles. Right? You stepped outside of your field of expertise. You got arrogant. You got prideful. You allowed these people to puff you up and to tell you, sweet stories about how successful you're going to be in this field that you knew nothing about. And you failed. And it is because of your ego, basically. Another group of American generals are in World War II. And I won't spend too much time talking about this because I'm kind of a buff on these military things, but I understand that it's not the bread and butter for a lot of people. But basically, George Marshall, he's this kind of architect behind the scenes who's pulling a lot of the strings during World War II to kind of organize things and get materiel places and kind of keep all of these divas, because there were some huge personalities during World War II. The general, Patton and Eisenhower and MacArthur and Nimitz. And you've got, and that's just to name a few, you have like these huge personalities, and he's able to kind of orchestrate them all and kind of do this dance with them and with the president and kind of keep everyone in line and everyone pushing towards the same goals in spite of their, titanic egos. And a lot of these men were ruined by their egos, not Eisenhower so much. He actually ends up being a fairly humble guy himself, but like MacArthur famously is just this total diva, and he has he's a talented general, but he ends up just basically ruining himself because he's got this huge ego and he can't keep it in check. And so he ends up being ruined by his inability to play nice with others. And long story short, Marshall is able to orchestrate all these successful campaigns during World War II, and he does it behind the scenes, and he doesn't get a lot of credit. Basically, if you've ever heard of Marshall, you've maybe heard of the Marshall Plan that was put in place to kind of rebuild Europe afterwards. It was his idea. The reason they put his name on it is because everyone else thought it was a bad idea and that it wouldn't work. It worked great, obviously, because Marshall was this genius of organization, but he's kind of the unsung hero behind the scenes. He doesn't get the big flashy, parades and the imitations that Patton and MacArthur get, and, the accolades that Eisenhower gets. He just kind of does his job and then kind of sinks off into history, having done an excellent job. And so that's basically some stories of people who were humble, people who were egotistical. And it talks about, the book basically tries to, pound this in through a series of contrasting stories where the egotistical people end up ruined on the, smashed on the rocks of their own ego and hubris. And the humble people end up learning and adapting, and they stay flexible and they stay hungry, and they're able to accomplish big things. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of takeaways that I had about ego as a concept. So here's a little blurb that I wrote in my own notes after reading this. I said, ego is a liar. It will tell you, that's my dog, Rudy. So hi, Rudy. Ego is a liar. It will tell you sweet lies about yourself to help protect you from facing difficult facts about life. It will drown you in the nectar of self-indulgence and denial. And at the end of the day, if you let your ego run wild, it will lock you up in a dark room and force feed you sickly sweet, honey-flavored bullcrap until you grow fat, slow, and sick on your own fantasies. And while this is happening, the real world will go on turning without you, heedless of your delusions and unconcerned with the balance that you think you are owed. That's a little blurb that I wrote there. I'm not sure if it makes any sense to anyone other than me, but basically, ego it's poison, right? It's the lies that we tell ourselves while the world keeps turning without us. It's, you can say, well, they only did this because, they were jealous or angry or the only reason I'm not successful is because of bad luck. And the only reason that person is successful is because of good luck or because, their dad was rich or whatever, right? Ego is the lies we tell ourselves to make up for our excuses. And the thing is that reality always wins, and the world keeps turning, and people don't care about what you think about the way things should be. Things will just go on without you. And there's a reason that Christians have long believed that pride is a sin. And here's a quote that's directly from the book. So it says, quote, Christians believe that pride is a sin because it is a lie. It convinces them that they are better than they are, that they are better than God made them. Pride leads to arrogance and then away from humility and connection with their fellow man. You don't have to be Christian to see the wisdom in this. You need only to care about your career to understand that pride, even in real accomplishments, is a distraction and a deluder, end quote. And, I mean, that's huge, right? Like, even if you have real accomplishments, if you're so drowned in pride and the praise of other people that's kind of feeding that pride, it's a distraction, and it's distracting you from going on to that next thing, to reaching for more, to striving to be better. And it's deluding you into believing that you're great and that you can't fail, but you're actually just as likely, if not more likely, to fail once you've been met with some success than you were in the first place. So you got to stay diligent. You got to stay on top of it. Here's another quote. Kind of along those lines. So, quote, you can't learn if you think you already know. You will not find the answers if you're too conceited and self-assured to ask the questions. You cannot get better if you're convinced you are the best, end quote. And that's a big one right there, guys. Like, if you already think you're the best at what you're doing, how are you going to improve? It's not really possible, right? Because you're not going to be looking to improve. You're not going to ask people. You're not going to learn from people. There's kind of a rule that's mentioned in the book about when someone's training. You need 3 people to be training with. You need someone who you are better than, that you can teach, and that will help to improve you. You need someone who you are equal to, that you can practice with, and that will help improve both of you. And you need someone who is better than you, that you can learn from, so that you can keep striving to get to that next level. And you need those 3 people in your life. Find them. If you don't have them right now, find them for real. Another great story from this book is Jackie Robinson, who some of you may know as the first Black Major League Baseball player. He went through hell, basically, to racially integrate baseball. And there was a lot of abuse piled on him for the part that he played in making that happen. Other players, fans, and managers, they abused him nonstop. He was hit deliberately with many, many pitches. People spat on him, threatened him, constantly shouted slurs at him. And so what made him uniquely qualified for this job, I mean, he had a temper, and he was known for fighting and standing up for himself before he comes to the league, but he was able to put all that aside in order to accomplish his greater goal. He knew that history had its eyes on him, that the world had its eyes on him, and he knew that if he let his ego get in the way and he let his temper get out of check, that he might ruin the chances of all other Black athletes who want to play in the league for generations. So he was able to keep his ego in check, put up with the abuse, and play world-class baseball. And his humility and ability to stay cool under that much pressure ensured that his legacy remains unquestionable to this day. So humility, not pride, as we see, is the key to greatness. And those who are great and have an ego, their ego only detracts from their legacy. So that's it for what I liked about the book. Let's head over to the science corner. All right, welcome to the Science Corner, and today we are talking in the field of psychology. And for those of you who are hard science snobs, I need you to back off and be nice to psychology, okay? Just because it's a soft science doesn't mean it's not a science, all right? So all of you chemistry nerds or medicine nerds or whatever nerds out there, be nice to psychology for a minute and bear with me, okay? Because this is a big one. And I'm talking today about Freud, and a lot of people think that Freud is a quack. But honestly, that's with the benefit of hindsight. Really, what he was a visionary and a pioneer in a field that was brand new. And he did a lot of work that other people then went and built upon and stood on his shoulders. And then now they get to turn around and say that he was wrong about everything. Whatever, it's fine. You know, people tend to not be humble enough, just like what we're talking about, humble enough to understand that what they've learned and accomplished is based off of the work that other people have done. And Freud is foundational on psychology and psychoanalysis. So Freud kind of comes up with the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. And we're talking about ego today, so I thought that would be kind of on point to talk about this. And the id is basically like the instinctual desires that we have, right? For like, sex and, food and violence and anger and lust and all these kind of basic kind of primal urges. That's what the id is, right? Kind of a set of uncoordinated instinctual desires. And the superego, that's our moralizing kind of part that says like, this is who I want to be. This is my values. This is my morality. This is my religion. This is my, my moral compass or whatever. And obviously the superego and the id are out of sync with each other. And so that's kind of where the ego comes in. And the ego is basically the go-between between the superego and the id, kind of trying to regulate that relationship between our morality and our moral compass and our basic desires for existence, like what the id is. And so Freud talks about how the ego is basically like a man on horseback, right? And maybe it's on an elephant if your id is too big, right? But basically the idea is that the horse is more powerful than the man, and the horse can do whatever it wants. At the end of the day, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with riding horses. I'm not exactly a huge horse rider here, but I've heard it said that the horse decides where to go at the end of the day. The man only thinks he's in control, but if the horse decides it's going in a certain direction, it's going in that direction. And there's not really that much that the man can do to stop it, right? And so the idea is that the ego is trying to kind of guide the horse, and it can only do so within a certain limitations, right? Like regardless of what the superego wants, you can't shut down all of your instinctual desires. You can't do so and be healthy either. And that's a lot of what Freud talks about is repression and, sexual repression and things like that. But I think it is kind of valid that we do have this kind of big overarching moral philosophy, and we do have these kind of underpinning instinctual kind of primal desires, and there is a go between there has to be some give and take on that, and hopefully over time we're able to master those kind of primal desires and become more efficient at handling them. But basically that's kind of where the id, ego, and superego kind of how it kind of shakes out. And if you're interested in learning more about that, there are great books on it. I don't have any recommendations off the top of my head. I have a couple on my shelf that I can't really for sure say that I do recommend. They're kind of old school and kind of quacky. But if I do find one, I will let you know. Honestly, this one is one where you can just go to the Wikipedia page and learn some cool stuff about it. That's basically what I did. Like I said, a couple of books on my shelf that I'm looking at right now that, I'm not even going to bother recommending those. But basically, that's it. That's id, ego, superego. This has been the Science Corner. Let's go over to the History Corner. All right, welcome to the History Corner. And this one, I'm actually drawing directly from the book. I kind of decided to hold this one back and save it for the History Corner. But I'm talking about Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes, basically. If you don't know who Genghis Khan is, then I don't know what to tell you. You should probably know who he is. But if you don't have any idea who he is, he's one of the greatest conquerors who ever lived. He was a Mongolian chieftain. He united a bunch of tribes, or was instrumental in uniting a bunch of tribes in Mongolia, who then branched out and formed one of the largest, most powerful empires in the history of the world, basically from far East Asia to Eastern Europe and down into the Middle East, and like vast empire full of many, many different peoples. And Genghis Khan kind of has this reputation of being just kind of a brute, kind of, using brute force and brute strength and overwhelming his enemies with, they had these kind of interesting tactics with Mongolian horse archers, the Mongudai or whatever, who were able to, the horseback archers who were extremely talented were basically able to defeat any other kind of medieval fighter. And because they were mobile and ranged, and so basically no one could ever get close enough to actually fight back against them, and so they were able to basically just slaughter them all with impunity. And so Genghis Khan, kind of the Mongolian hordes spread out all over, like I said, East Asia, all the way into Europe and into the Middle East, and this vast empire. One thing that they don't get a lot of credit for is the humility with which they approached new ideas. Most conquerors, and this is true of like the Romans and Alexander the Great and Macedonians and the British Empire and all these great empires throughout history, when they go to a place, they bring their culture with them and they leave it there, and they kind of beat out the old culture that the locals had, and it kind of put their own culture on it. And there have been some exceptions to that, right? Like the Persian Empire, for example, was notable for allowing religious freedom. The Romans kind of towards the apex of the empire kind of realized that you got to let people kind of do their own thing and you just kind of tax them or whatever. But most empires make the mistake of thinking, look, the reason I'm conquering you is because my culture is better than yours. And so you might as well just have my culture. Right. And it's reasonable in its kind of evilness for them to think that. But what the Mongols did under Genghis Khan is every time they took over a place, they would integrate everything good that culture had to offer, right? Their military technology, their science, their art, their religion, they would just integrate it. And he had hordes and hordes of actuaries and accountants and, people who would just go throughout the culture and say, look, we want these things in our culture, so let's just adopt them. And they were kind of, famous for being able to just adopt whatever good thing would improve their empire. And it's one of the reasons why they're able to continue to expand. And a lot of people would just kind of surrender before they even came there, because Genghis Khan had a policy like, look, if you make me take you over, I'm going to slaughter you all. And if you just surrender and kind of come voluntarily, then I'm going to let you keep your gods and your family and your everything. And I'm even going to adopt some of your stuff. I'll even have an open mind to whatever you guys want to do, and I won't slaughter you. And all you got to do is pay some taxes, right? And so this has kind of this knock-on effect where people are just surrendering wholesale to the great Khan before he's even knocked on the door. They just want to be part of his empire. It's a great strategy. They were able to integrate a lot of things, and it's because they had the humility to say, look, we don't know everything. And, these guys, even though we're whooping them on the battlefield, these guys have a lot to offer, and we're going to make that part of ourselves. Kind of cool, kind of really cool, actually. This has been the History Corner. Let's head over to the Random Corner. All right, welcome to the Random Corner. And today in the Random Corner, I want to talk about the ongoing debate about whether certain animals have an ego or a sense of self. And it's obviously a very difficult thing to say for certain. For example, some animals seem to be able to recognize themselves in a mirror, like chimps and elephants and stuff like that. Dolphins, I think. And dogs seem to be able to recognize their own scent. And maybe like the voice of their master or whatever. All these things kind of indicate that animals in some ways are capable of thinking about themselves. But as of right now, we don't really have any conclusive evidence at all that animals are out there pondering the big questions about the universe. It's difficult for us to compare because they inherently don't think the way that we do. And we don't think the way that they do. And so it's difficult for us. It's kind of an apples and oranges situation, but it's probably going to be a little while before a chimp utters like the Descartesian phrase, cogito ergo sum, or whatever, I think, therefore I am, or whatever. Right. Like I said, it's apples and oranges. It's difficult for us to examine how they think. It's difficult for them to examine how we think. There's probably not a lot of bridge that's there. And I don't think we will ever really see a satisfying conclusion about the animal ego issue. But, I wanted to talk about it because I've heard arguments that cats are people too and dogs are people too. They're not. They're just not. And especially like farm animals, I could tell you some stories about chickens and pigs and things like that would have you not wanting to eat meat for a little while. But suffice it to say, they are not sentient creatures. They're just dumb animals. That is maybe hard for someone out there to hear, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that's painful for you. Let's go back to the main review. All right, so welcome back to the main review, and this is traditionally where I talk about the things that I didn't like so much about the book. And overall, I have to say that I love this book. I have to say that because I usually love the books. There's usually one or two things, piddly, inconsequential things that I didn't love. And this is the same case for this book. So, and I have to admit, before I even start talking about this, that it might be my own ego that's in the way with these things that I didn't like. So maybe it was my imagination, but the pages of this book seem kind of definitely positively riddled with just a smidge of arrogance. And again, that might be my own ego just bristling at the things that he was saying. And I'm willing to admit that, but I can't really imagine personally having the audacity to write a book like this, right? Unless he's just superhumanly humble. I can't imagine that this book was just a work of utter egolessness, right? Like, for example, and this is again, like, I feel so like such a jerk for this. And I feel bad even mentioning it, right? But this guy has ego as the enemy tattooed on his bicep, which to me is, it just seems like kind of a dead giveaway that he might not be as humble as he lets on. However, I am once again willing to admit the likelihood that my own ego was just bruised from hearing some hard truths in this book, right? And so I might be ascribing less than pure motives to Mr. Holiday for writing this book. And that might definitely not be fair. Okay, but there it is. One thing that I can say about this book that I think is valid criticism, regardless of my own sore pride or anything like that, is that the end of the book just kind of dragged on and then petered out without great resolution of any kind. And the bulk of the book, I have to say, was awesome and full of interesting stories and nuggets of real high quality, high intensity wisdom that I loved. And like this is a book that like has changed the way that I think about the world. So any criticism that I have is almost painful for me to say, but the end I feel like just kind of fizzled out and faded away. And that's kind of a bummer to me. And I wonder if maybe I just failed to resonate with the final takeaways of the book, or if it really did just kind of dwindle a little bit at the end. And really the only way is, I mean, you'll just need to pick this up for yourself and give it a read, right? There are tons of stories that I didn't have time to include in this episode. And if you want to pick it up, I'd highly recommend doing so. I just personally, the ending didn't hit as hard for me. And that just kind of took something away. But without further ado, let's do the rating of the bells. That's right. This is a 4-star, 4-bell book. And I was just really, really pleased with it. Like I said, I can honestly say that this book made me think about my life, which is really the best that you can hope when you pick up a book, right? It's the highest thing I think that a book can do is entertain you and inform you and make you think about ways that you can improve your own life, right? In fact, the only thing keeping this book from being an outright 5-star book for me is that the ending didn't really resonate with me. And I'm a big fan of meaningful endings. And to that end, I'm going to move on here in a second to the parting thought and hopefully give you something worth chewing on as I wrap things up. Before I do that though, if you like the show, please follow me on Facebook, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast streaming service you use, and share it with a friend who you think would get a kick out of it. The show is growing. I'm really grateful for that. This is a labor of love for me. It means a lot to me that someone somewhere out there might be listening to this and getting something out of it. If you love the show and you'd like to support it, head on over to my Patreon page. You can give me a couple of bucks to help keep me in books. Thank you so much to those of you who have already done so. It means the world to me. If you'd like to contact me for any reason, complaints, corrections, book recommendations, or suggestions on how to improve the show, you can email me at whatstomreading@gmail.com. All right, let's wrap this one up. So this quote is directly from the book, and it's something that stuck with me. And it comes from a section that's discussing greatness, glory, and accomplishing big things. And these are things that many, if not most of us, aspire to. And the quote, it just really resonated strongly with me. So here we go. Quote, "It doesn't matter how talented you are, how great your connections are, how much money you have. When you want to do something big and important and meaningful, you will be subjected to treatment ranging from indifference to outright sabotage. Count on it." End quote. Whew. Now, I can't tell you the amount of times that I have started a project that was important to me only to be met with indifference. And there are a number of reasons for that. A lot of it is that people don't have that much time or bandwidth to care about whatever your thing is, right? And it might be that your thing is not very good. That has certainly been the case for me, that whatever I'm making just isn't that good or interesting, right? It takes a lot of perseverance to keep on doing something when you aren't being met with results. And I have quit so many things. And this podcast, thankfully, has been growing. And I really appreciate those of you who have been listening and those of you who have taken the time to share this. That means the world to me, but that's not what this is about here. I've experienced many times, and you have likely experienced the same thing if you've tried to bite off a big chunk of life, that for whatever reason, people rarely ever seem to cheer you on, right? I mean, the people who love you do. And that's how you know that they're people who love you, right? And the people who are in your corner, they're the ones who are cheering you on. Those are people that you want to surround yourself with and have in your life, right? You know, not sycophants or yes men, but people who sincerely love you and who want the best for you and who are willing to give you some of the time of their day out of their lives to hear you out on your ideas, right? That's what you want in friends and in loved ones. So if you can find those people are treasure, and treat them right, right? But for whatever reason, like I said, most people will not cheer you on. Some of them will think you're vain and arrogant for even setting out to make a difference. Some of them think you're presumptuous for daring to reach beyond your station in life. Some of them will actively root against you. This is kind of a personal story here, but I don't mind just kind of spewing out into the world, the wider world, because, you know, it's a true story. It really did happen. And maybe it's something similar has happened to you. But during my first semester at law school, I worked hard to network with my peers, to spread general good cheer, and to help make sure that we weren't all taking ourselves too seriously. Back then, I started a podcast where I'd talk a little bit about law school and what was going on. And I would interview one of my classmates with every episode. And I thought things were going pretty good until one day, I learned that someone at the law school had started a rumor that I was a Nazi skinhead white supremacist. And the only reason I can think of that they would have done that is that I'm bald. And it's not my fault. It's genetic. It just is a thing that happened to me. I am not a Nazi. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm actually this was actually very hurtful to me because I'm actually like I said, a huge World War II buff, and I'm very familiar with the hideous atrocities of the Nazis. And I'm horrified that anyone would think that I was associated in any way with that type of movement. It broke my heart. And my first reaction initially, right, was to laugh at how absurd that accusation was. And I knew even then that very few of my classmates would believe it, right? But the accusation, it still punctured me. It still hit me in a really raw place for some reason. And I'm ashamed to admit that I let that rumor just rot inside of me as I became more and more bitter towards my classmates. I became convinced that everybody was talking about me behind my back and that they all thought I was this horrible, like the worst thing you can be, basically. And so I stopped recording my podcast and I withdrew from my classmates. And as I said, I am ashamed of this reaction because I know now that it was way, way, way more my ego than anything that caused me to deflate like I did then. And if I'm honest in my reflection, it is unlikely that anyone was talking about me behind my back. The rumor was more than likely just an offhandedly mean comment from one of my classmates who didn't like that I made them feel small one day, right? Law school is hard. And I worked hard to make sure that we weren't taking ourselves too seriously. After all, lawyers are famously and almost unbearably egotistical. And so I thought I'd be doing a service by engaging in some self-deprecating humor about the field, myself included, right? I have no doubt that I must have bothered someone to the point that they felt it was necessary to slander me with a horrible accusation. Now, I have since spoken to a number of my classmates. Many of them never even heard the rumor. And the ones who did were quick to say that they never thought anything of it when they heard it. And at the end of the day, it hit me right in my most sensitive spot, right in the ego, right? I shut down my podcast and quit talking to people over basically nothing because my pride was hurt. And that sucks. That's missed opportunities, missed chances for relationships, bad days that I didn't have to have, like an entire semester of bad days that I didn't have to have, 2 semesters of bad days that I didn't have to have. And it tainted my whole experience at the law school over just probably something that didn't take someone more than 2 seconds worth of just being a jerk. right? And I let them hurt me that deep. Now, I'm happy to report that a similar incident happened at the end of last semester at the business school. And like, happy to report is kind of like not the best way to put it. But basically, a classmate of mine took it upon themselves to contact a prospective employer of mine and tell them all about my incompetence and lack of fitness for the job, lack of professionalism, yada, 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 yada. And this is partially because I spend a lot of time trying to basically say, look, guys, this is not that big of a deal. Life is bigger than business school. Life is bigger than law school. It's going to be fine. Grades don't matter that much. You know, I really try to kind of, you know, be encouraging in that way to kind of help myself and others around me have good perspective. And most people seem to like that, but there are a few people who it really, really seems to rub the wrong way. And I haven't found the right balance on that. I don't know if I'm just being a jerk to them, and so they feel like they've got to retaliate in some way. But basically, this classmate, I must have rubbed them the wrong way. And unfortunately for them, my brother is an employee of that company and immediately passed their comments back to me, just basically in real time. And I went and I spoke to this person and carefully, patiently explained to them that I knew what they had done, that I was hurt by their assessment of me, but that I know that they likely did it for, you know, to seem cool to an old friend, you know, that they knew at that company or whatever. And I told them that I forgave them on the spot. I shook their hand, and I genuinely haven't thought about it since. At first it was painful and I was angry and I was like, you know, I can't believe they did this, and kind of blew up my chances of working for this company maybe someday. And I was angry at first, but then I thought, you know what, this comes from a place of pain, right? And I'm not telling this story to brag in any way, except to say that I was able to handle this second ordeal much better than the first, because I've been studying Stoic philosophy, like the philosophies contained in this book, Ego is the Enemy. I know better who I am today because of books like this. I know what I'm capable of. I know what motivates small people to act in a small way. And I can honestly say that I can sincerely pity this classmate who went out of their way to try to cut me down, because that sort of action, like I said, it only comes from a place of insecurity and pain. And like, yeah, maybe I rubbed them the wrong way. Maybe I am the jerk. You know, it's like, that's possible. And I'm willing to admit that, but I am trying to work on it, right? It's nothing to me what they think of me, because I know that I'm a good student. I get good grades. I can honestly say that I'm trying to be a good man as well. I don't always succeed, and I have plenty to work on before I'm fit for polite society, but I am confident that I will get there, because, and this sounds like such a jerkish thing to say, but like, I'm really, really, really trying to be humble about this. I'm trying to admit when I'm wrong. I'm trying to admit that I could be insensitive, that I can be boorish, that I can be loud, that I can be flagrant and obnoxious, and all these things. And I'm trying to improve that, you know, like I said, in my effort to, you know, be self-deprecating and make out like it's not as big of a deal as it is. I try to do that to be comforting. It obviously really bothers some people. It maybe comes across as arrogant or, you know, like I don't care about the opportunities that I've been given, which is, it couldn't be further from the truth. I just want people to, you know, not take themselves so seriously. And I want to not take myself so seriously, because it's painful if you take yourself seriously and then you don't perform as well as you'd like, or you take yourself super seriously and, you know, the dice doesn't roll out in your favor. You know, you'll have a lot happier life if you don't rely so much on ego, right? And so just remember, in your own life, when you're setting up to take your big shot, that most people are probably going to be indifferent. Some people are going to be outright hostile. Regardless of the reception you get, though, if you truly believe that something is important and worthwhile, then you have to have the guts to keep pressing forward no matter what. If you rely on the praise of the outside world to keep you going, that will not sustain you. It will either be too slow in coming, or worse, it will come thick and fast, and it will cloud your head and obscure your vision of what you originally set out to do. You might become beholden to your fans and your critics, and your mission will slide out of you until you find yourself basically living to sustain the praise of a fickle mob of people who don't care that much about you or your vision. So don't let your pride dictate what you do with your time. Don't let the opinion of others who do not understand your vision taint what is real and true and important to you. If it is worth it to you, do it. If you're humble enough to know that you have vast room for improvement and you ambitiously pursue that improvement, eventually the world will come around to your vision. Or not. Either way, if it is worth it to you to do it, then you should do it. Press forward, stay hungry, stay humble, stay diligent. Above all else, remember, ego is the enemy. That's it for today, guys. Have a nice day. You deserve it.